land won't be destroyed. The fact that you and I are working here today is evidence of that.
Olá, bom dia.
Hello, good
Estamos
morning.
começando agora a quinta
So,
mesa do
we are
Seminário
now beginning
Internacional
our fifth
Políticas
panel in the
Habitacionais da Obra
International
Social,
Seminar
organizado
Housing
pela
Policies for
FAU-USP,
Social
em
Rent, organized
colaboração
by
com a
FAU-USP in
Secretaria de
collaboration
Habitação do Município de
with the
São
Housing
Paulo,
Secretariat
com
of
apoio
the
da
Municipality of
FAPESB,
São
da
Paulo,
Fundação Rosa
support
Luxemburgo
from
e do
FAPESB,
Observatório
the
Global de Aluguéis
Rosa Luxemburgo
Temporários.
Foundation, and the
Queria dar
Global
boas-vindas
Observatory of
a quem
Temporary
assiste.
Rent.
Eu sou Felipe Suzuki
Welcome,
Ursini,
everybody. I'm
sou
Felipe
mestrando
Suzuki
na
Ursini.
FAU-USP e
I'm a
pesquisador do
master's
LabCidade.
student at FAU-USP
Eu vou
and a
fazer a
researcher
mediação
at
dessa mesa, cujo
LabCidades. I
tema
will
é a
be the mediator
financiarização do
of this
aluguel.
session, and the topic is
Nós
the
vamos ter fala em
financialization
português
of
e em
rent.
espanhol,
We are going to have
então
interventions
estamos
in
ao vivo em
Portuguese
dois links
and
no canal
Spanish,
do YouTube
and we're live in
Debatedora.
two links
Deles,
in the
o áudio vai ser
LabCidades
sempre o
YouTube
original,
channel,
então
one
em
of which
português e
has the original
espanhol,
audio
onde eu
in
estou falando,
Portuguese and
e o outro
Spanish,
sempre com a
and the
tradução
other one
simultânea do
with the
inglês.
simultaneous
Não
translation
teremos,
into
portanto,
English.
tradução do português
Therefore,
para o
we will
espanhol ou
not
do espanhol para o
have
português,
interpretation
mas a gente combinou de falar
between
não
Portuguese and
muito rápido
Spanish,
para
but we are
facilitar a
going
comunicação.
to speak slowly to
Vão
facilitate the
ser apresentados
communication.
agora 4 trabalhos que
We will
discutem, a
have
partir de
four
diferentes
presentations
países e cidades,
discussing
o
from
financiamento da
different
produção
countries and
imobiliária e
cities
das
the
políticas públicas
financing
habitacionais
of real estate production
através de
and
instrumentos do
public housing
mercado de
policies
capitais
through
e
capital market
especificamente aqueles que
instruments,
mobilizam o aluguel
especially those that
como um mecanismo
mobilize
gerador de
rent
rentabilidade futura.
as a mechanism to
Os
create
estudos
future
questionam a
profit.
compatibilidade da lógica
The studies
financeira
question the
em sua imposição
compatibility
de uma
between the financial
institucionalidade
logic in
própria
its imposition
com o
of its own
atendimento de fato das demandas
institutionality
habitacionais
with the meeting
e
of the
também
housing demands,
se debruçam sobre o
and
papel desempenhado pelo
also
Estado nos
analyze the
diferentes
role
casos nos
played by the
processos de
state in the different
financiarização da
cases
moradia de
in the
aluguel.
financialization process
Depois
for
das 4 apresentações,
rent-based living.
que vão durar 12
After the
minutos
four
cada, eu vou
presentations
chamar a
that
nossa
will last 12
debatedora
minutes
para
each,
fazer suas
I will invite
considerações
our
e
debater to
devolver
make her
perguntas para os
comments
autores.
and to ask
Então, eu
questions
vou
to the
já deixar as
authors.
boas-vindas e
So
agradecer a presença da Lucia
I
Shimbo,
would like to
que é
thank
professora
Lucia
e
Shimbo for
docente
being
do
here.
Instituto de
She
Arquitetura e
is a
Urbanismo da
professor
USP,
in the
São
architecture
Carlos,
and Urbanism Institute at USP, São Carlos. She has a wide trajectory of research in our topic today, the coordination between housing policies, real estate market, and financialization. Thank you, Lucia, for being here. Our presentation will start with Mariana Cristina Adão. She's also from São Carlos. And the title is Finances, Impact Finances in Social Housing and Social Rent. Then it will be Marcela Rubio, who studies law, and she will present human rights. And then we will move on to Natalia, and she will present temporary rent in the Buenos Aires city, heterogeneity, temporization, and standardization. She's from the Urban and Regional Study Center, and Carolina, she's from the Caribbean Study Center, both from Buenos Aires. And lastly, Santiago Echahi Kotler, he's from the Polytechnic University of Catalonia, and he's speaking from Mexico City, and he will introduce new actors in the housing market for rent in the city of Mexico, challenges and opportunities in public housing for the real estate fibers. I ask that the presenters try not to go over the 12 minutes so that we have enough time for the debate. I will interrupt you when you have 4 minutes left to let you know. So I apologize beforehand for interrupting. And the audience, if you want to send in questions, you can write in the YouTube chat or here in Zoom. It's not necessary to wait until the end of the presentations. You can send the questions while the presentations are happening. We will collect your questions, and in the end, depending on how long we have, I will pose the questions for the panelists. So I will now invite Mariana Cristina Adão. Please, you have the floor.
Tá dando para ver? Certinho?
Can you see my screen? Yes.
Bom,
Well,
bom dia.
good morning. My name is Mariana. I am a doctorate student in the Institute of Architecture and Urbanism in the University of São Paulo. I'm supervised by Professor Lucia, the debater of our session, and my presentation is called Impact Finances in Social Rent Policies, and it's part of my doctorate research that seeks to analyze the rent provision actors in Brazil that's mediated by the capital market and civil associations. And social rent is brought here as accessible and affordable rent that's into low-income populations. And the impact finances or impact investment terms in the economic studies field is inserted in one of the extremities of social finance. And social finance is meant to create social value and may also include the creation of financial value. And it classifies the types of finances according to the intensity of each value generated, being that the impact finances are the ones that have the most impact in the creation of financial value. In that sense, impact finances are defined as investments that aim to provide financial return linked to positive social impact. This discussion about impact investment is rooted in the discussion on investment in social causes in the 60s, but only after the financial crisis of 2008, they started being publicized in the provision of social services. Two discourses structure the discussion of impact finances. First, in the economic and administration field, they say that this type of finances are a critic to the traditional financial system and an attempt to create new social and environmental values. And in the urban and geography studies, it said that that type of finances are a new logic to regulate poverty because it seeks to diminish poverty through behavior changes in the low-income population, and they are an attempt to solve the problems caused by capitalism through a reformulated capitalism. So they would re-legitimize the finance that lost prestige after the financial crisis. Impact finances have been used in the rent market, both in countries that traditionally have public investment in social rent and in countries that don't have that type of investment or that have incipient initiatives. In the first case, the impact finances have altered the provision structures existing, and in the second case, they create new structures. In both contexts, social rent can be seen as a new frontier for financialization. Here, I analyze who are the actors that participate in these processes, their practices, and the consequences for the provision of social rent. And in order to analyze the structures of countries with investment in rent, I use examples from the literature, and to analyze countries without that investment, I use case study methods with documental research and interviews, which are part of my doctorate research, analyzing two Brazilian cases. In the first case, the AJ bonds in the UK are funds that seek to provide funding to housing policies for creation of rent-based living. And only after the financial crisis, after the difficulty in taking out loan, they have attracted situation. They were created by the Housing Financing Corporation, an organization that provides funding for the organizations and that counts with the participation of the state through the Housing Corporation. They offer a low return paid through the income from the rent, sustained with public capital, and this attracts institutional investors that seek to diversify their wallets and attracts international investors. Here, the states acts as the guarantor if any association goes bankrupt, and also through the benefits that are directly transferred to the tenants. These investments facilitated the transfer of capital for the functioning of the associations, but this increased the financing costs, and the families were exposed to the increase in rent and in increase in the waiting lines and in rejection by the association when they are considered a high risk of default. Another case in Italy, the CDP, the biggest public bank in the country, created the Housing Investment Fund to invest in investments that generate income based on rent, in this case, social rent. Many local governments started making investments in these funds, and this caused the state to create the Integrated Fund System, CIF, which is a legislative framework in which institutional private public investors invest in FIA that invest in local funds, and these local funds also receive investment from other investors to provide financing for the building of houses for social rent by local governments or by the third sector. In this structure, the funds became the actors of the capital markets, and it also attracted investors focused on diversifying their wallet because they're low risk investments. And as a consequence, there was an increased control of capitalist actors on these funds, and this led to a favoring of more profitable locations for the building of these houses. In countries where we don't have social housing that is rent-based, there is also that type of institution. In Brazil, two types of the system are being developed in São Paulo. The first one, Soma, was launched in 2021. It's envisioned by incorporator Majiki, who has been present in the My House, My Life program ever since the beginning. And they realized many families couldn't acquire a real estate because of the price of the houses. So they offered constructions at a lower price, and they went to the Gaia Group, a securities company focused on social impact businesses, and also Dynamo to create the certificate of real estate and facilitate that construction. And the second is La Pena in the east area of São Paulo, is a process that is being studied by an NGO that has acted in this neighborhood, also with participation from Blend Lab, a
que é um
company
modelo de
that uses
financiamento
blended
utilizado por
finances
negócios de
to
impacto
finance
que
that type
prestam
of
diversos
enterprise,
tipos de investimentos, então
mixing
desde
several
recursos
types
públicos e
of
filantrópicos
investments,
até
including
investimentos
public
por
and
terceiros
philanthropic
com
resources and
diversos níveis de
investment with
risco.
financial return
Em
and
ambas essas
several
estruturas, a
levels of
Soma e o
risk.
Lapena, o fluxo
In both
financeiro ele
these
permite que os
structures, Soma and
investidores
La
que
Pena,
financiam a
the
construção
financial
dos
flow
empreendimentos passa
is in the
pelos
investors that
intermediários que fazem a gestão
finance
dessa construção
goes
e
through
com
the
início da prestação
intermediates
do
that
serviço
manage
de aluguel, os valores
the
pagos pelos
construction, and
inquilinos
with the
são
beginning of the
destinados
payment
tanto
of
para a
rent, the
remuneração dos
rent paid
investidores
is
através dos
destined both for the
intermediários,
remuneration of the
quanto para o
investors through
funcionamento da ONG
intermediates
ou da
and the
associação que fará a
working of
gestão.
the NGO or the
Em
association that
relação
is the
aos
manager.
atores, os investidores, no
In
caso do
relation to the
Soma, são
actors,
5
the
empresas
investors, in the
privadas,
case of Soma,
sendo que
are
4
five
são do
private
ramo da construção
companies,
civil, que,
four
conforme
civil
foi relatado
construction
nas
companies,
entrevistas, é um
and as
aspecto que
was
ajuda no convencimento do
reported in the
investimento
interviews,
desses
this is an
atores.
aspect
Além
that
disso, também, em parte dessas empresas, o investimento no
facilitates
Soma, ele
convincing
integra
the
a agenda
investment
ESG, que
actors,
são as
and
práticas
they are
ambientais,
also
sociais e
part
de
of the
governança,
DSG
que
practices, the
se relacionam
development, social,
com
and
os
governance
Objetivos de
practices
Desenvolvimento
that are
Sustentável.
related to the
No
SDGs, the
Tenho
Lapena,
mais
Sustainable
com o
4
Development
Blended
Goals.
minutos, ok?
You have 4 minutes,
Ok.
Mariana.
No
Okay.
Lapena, com o Blended Finance, a
In La
intenção é
Pena,
ter
with
uma maior
blended
variedade
finance,
de
the
investidores,
intent is
também
having
envolvendo recursos de
more
desenvolvimento,
variety in
como
investors, also
filantrópicos, públicos de
in,
fomento e comerciais,
involving
com investidores institucionais,
philanthropic and
individuais e bancos.
commercial and
Os
fostering
intermediários, eu
investors.
destaquei aqui
And
os
the
principais, que no caso
intermediates,
do
I
Soma são
highlighted
os
the main ones in the
realizadores,
case
que
of
também são
some the
responsáveis pela
people
ONG,
who
que fará a gestão dos
idealized and are
inquilinos,
also responsible
que é a
for the
Magic,
NGOs that
Gaia
will
e Enina,
manage the
e no
tenants,
Lapena é a
Magic,
Fundação
Gaia, and
Setúbal,
Ginamo, and La
que é
Peña,
a
the
idealizadora,
Setúbal
e o Blend
Foundation,
Lab. E o Blend Lab,
and
por
Blend
sua
Lab.
vez, ele é formado pela Dynamo,
And Blend
que
Lab is
atua
composed by
no Soma, e
Dynamo,
também pelo Blend
that
Group, que é
acts in Soma, and
uma
also the
consultoria
Blend
de
Group,
Blended
a
Finance.
consultancy
O
on
prestador de
blended
serviço
finance. The
no
service
Soma é
provider
a ONG, que é
for
formada pelos
Soma
três
is the
atores,
NGO, composed by
e
the
no
three
Lapena,
actors,
possivelmente, uma
and in La
associação
Pena,
civil.
possibly
Essa
a civil
estrutura, ela é bem mais
society
simplificada
organization.
do que a
This
estrutura
structure is much more
encontrada
simplified than the structures that are found
nos casos europeus,
in the
e os
European
atores, eles
cases, and the
desenvolvem diferentes,
actors
mais de um
here
papel, o que
develop
acaba gerando até uma
or
confusão
actually
pelos próprios
play more than
participantes de
one
qual
role,
que é o
which
papel que
creates a
cada um tem nessa
confusion by the
estrutura.
participants as to the roles that
O
each one
Soma,
has in
como
this
já está em
structure.
fase de ocupação do
Soma,
edifício, é
since
possível
the building
visualizar
has already
alguns
been
impactos do
occupied,
instrumento
we
financeiro
can
que é
see some
utilizado
impacts
aqui.
of the financial
A
instrument
escolha
that is
desse
used, the
instrumento, ele foi pelo
CRI.
fato de ser um
The choice of
instrumento
this instrument is
consolidado no
because it's a
mercado de capitais e
consolidated
adequado ao
instrument in
objeto
the
a ser
capital
financiado,
market
que são
and
moradias e
appropriate to
aluguel.
the object to be
Esse
financed,
instrumento ele permite que haja
rent-based
lucro e
living.
também permite que
And
haja um
this
ajuste
instrument
nesse
allows
lucro
for
para que seja
profit and
mais
an
um
adjustment
pouco
to
mais
that
abaixo
profit
de
so that
investimentos
it's a bit lower
tradicionais.
than
Um dos
traditional investments.
entrevistados, ele traz 4
One
formas de
of the
utilização desse
interviewees
instrumento
brings
para fins
4 forms of
sociais:
using that
integrar o
instrument for
valor
social
financiado do
ends,
preço do aluguel, que não
integrating the
permitiria que fosse um aluguel
value, the
acessível,
finance
diminuir a
value
margem de lucro
into the
das
rent,
empresas que participaram do
diminishing the
empreendimento,
profit margin
ter
of
alguma
the
forma de
companies that
subsídio público
participated in the
ou diminuir
enterprise,
o retorno dos
having public
investidores.
subsidies, or
No caso
diminishing
do Soma,
the
foi
return for
através da
investors.
diminuição
In
da
the case
margem
of
das
Soma,
empresas
it was
também e
through
também
the
através do lucro dos
decrease of the margin
investidores.
of the companies and also the
Grande
profit of
desafio
the
destacado
investors.
por todos os
A huge
entrevistados foi a
challenge
inclusão
highlighted
da
by
ONG
all
nessa estrutura,
interviewees was the
que é uma
inclusion of
grande
the NGO in
dificuldade do
this
mercado de
structure
capitais
because
em
it's a huge
aceitar a
difficulty of
integração
the
do terceiro
capitals
setor.
market
E
to
isso
accept the
demonstra que
integration
talvez
of the third sector, and
está
this
tendo uma
demonstrates
nova
that there may
reestruturação
be a
está sendo
new
modelada pelo
uh,
mercado de capitais para a
structuring
provisão
that
de
is being
serviços
modeled
sociais.
by the capital market,
Para
the
concluir
capital's
a
market for
apresentação,
the
eu trago
provision of
alguns
social
comparativos entre os casos
services. To
apresentados.
conclude,
Em
I bring
relação aos
some comparisons
instrumentos,
between
cada
the cases
estrutura
presented,
utiliza um instrumento
comparisons between the cases
diferente, e
presented.
ainda que aqui no Brasil ambas as
Each
estruturas
structure
utilizem o
uses a
CRI,
different instrument,
no
and even
Lapena
though in
há essa
Brazil both
intenção de
structures
utilizar o Blended
use the
Finance,
CRI, in
então
La
as
Penha
finanças
there
de
is
impacto
this
elas se
intention
mostram
of using
bastante
blended
adaptáveis a
finance,
esse
so
sistema
impact
financiarizado.
finance is
Da mesma
shown as
forma,
very
há uma
adaptable to
variedade
the
prática na
financialized
variedade de
system,
instrumentos, que é
and
uma
in the
habilidade
same way,
também dos
there is a
atores.
variety of
Os
instruments, there is
investidores
also a variety
europeus,
of
na maioria, são
actors. The
institucionais
European
e,
investors
tendo
are
atraído também, no
usually
caso do Reino
institutional,
Unido,
and
investidores
in the case of the
internacionais.
UK,
E nos casos
international.
brasileiros, são empresas
And
que
in
foram
Brazilian
selecionadas e
cases, they're
podendo, no caso do
companies that were
Lapena, envolver
selected, and
investidores
that may, in the
individuais
case of
e
La Pena,
institucionais também.
involve individual and
Os
institutional
intermediários,
investors.
no
The
meio, é o
intermediates
THFC, que é um órgão que
in
tem a
the
participação do
UK are
Estado.
the
No
THFC,
SIC
a
italiano,
State
são os fundos
Participation
imobiliários e
Authority,
gestores, sendo que o
and
FIA, que é
in
um
the Italian
poder por si
example are
âmbito
management
federal, é de
funds,
iniciativa de um banco público.
and we
E nos
have a
casos
public
brasileiros, os
bank
intermediários são
initiative fund,
representados por agentes
and in the
supervisores
Brazilian
capitais,
cases,
que se
the intermediates
especializaram
are
nesses
actors in
investimentos,
the capitals
assim como
market
também
that
a participação do
specialize in
terceiro
these
setor.
investments and also the
Os prestadores
participation
de
of the
serviço em
third
todos os
sector.
casos são o terceiro setor ou o
The
governo,
service providers
e os
in all
impactos
cases are the
percebidos
third
nos casos
sector or the
europeus que
government,
adaptaram os
and the
dispositivos
impacts
existentes,
seen in the
autores
European
trazem que
cases
houve
that
um
adopted
prejuízo
the
para as
existing
famílias
structures
por ter
author said that there was damage done to the livelihood of the families because they had to provide profit for the investors. So families with lower risk of default were selected. And in the Brazilian cases, it was already built in a profitable region and it promises a below market rent. Since it's in the beginning of its application, we cannot verify the social impacts of this enterprise, but both Soma and La Pena, they identified a market niche that is not addressed by public policies or by the private market, and they want to be seen as the market itself, by the market itself as a new form of investment. And in the case of investors, they have altered the scope of their practices that used to be philanthropic to impact investments. That's it. Thank you very much.
Obrigado. Vou
Thank
passar
you.
agora
I
a
will
Marcela.
now pass it over
Bem-vinda,
to
Marcela.
Marcela. Welcome, Marcela.
Vocês estão vendo aqui minha tela?
Can you see my
Vemos
screen?
sim.
Bom, bom dia a todos. Queria
Good
agradecer tanto a
morning,
oportunidade
everyone.
de
I would like
apresentar
to
minha
thank
pesquisa,
you
quanto
for the
agradecer ao
opportunity to
evento,
make my
dar
presentation
esse
and for the
espaço
organization
para
of this
debater,
event, because this is an important space
e
for
inclusive temas tão
discussion
importantes.
about these such
Queria também fazer
important
disclaimer que meu trabalho
topics.
o
I would
trabalho
also
de
like to
mestrado,
say
que ainda
that
está em
this
construção.
is my
Mestrado
PhD
em
thesis
Direito,
that
minha
is
graduação
still
também é em
under,
Direito,
I'm
então
still
eu
working
tenho
on it,
um
and
olhar
I'm
mais
also,
jurídico que
I'm a
humano, mas que eu
graduate
acho que
in
dialoga
law,
bastante com
but I
os
believe all
temas
of these,
urbanos e jurídicos
my
que venho
graduation
abordados aqui no seminário.
dialogues with the important topics
Enfim,
on
eu queria
housing that we are
adentrar
discussing in
no
this seminar.
que são finanças
So
sustentáveis no
we all
financiamento
talk about
social.
what are
Queria
sustainable
falar um pouco sobre o que
finances
são esses
and social
recursos sustentáveis,
housing.
né? Então,
And I
o
would
meu
like to first
trabalho
of
vai
all
olhar para
talk about the
para
concept
esse
of
instrumento
sustainable
financeiro. Então, é uma emissão de dívida
finances.
corporativa
And
de
I would say
capital
that it's
financeiro com o objetivo de atrair investidores.
the issuance of
Ela vai me
corporate debt
ajudar
in
a
the
conhecer
financial
um
market
pouco
with an
de
aim to
para, enfim, para
attract
atrair
investors.
investimento na atividade
When we talk about
econômica, tem
investing
duas
in the
formas, assim,
economic
no geral.
activity, there are
Ou você
two ways.
faz um
You
empréstimo
can
bancário ou você
get loans
simplesmente
from the banking
repassar,
system, or
pulveriza
you go to the
essa
market
dívida. Só que para
with
um
this debt.
empréstimo bancário, você
But for a
exige certas
bank
garantias
loan, you
e o
need to
ônus
give
de atrair
certain
de
guarantees,
investidores
and the
e
onus,
a mercado para contrair
and
essa
if you go
dívida
to the
atrair
market
investidores. Você pode
and
tanto repassar
to
taxas
contract this
como
debt, you have to
provisões,
attract
esse é o imposto do
investors
trabalho, e
and
você colocar um
pay your
rótulo
rates.
sustentável, SG,
So, and in order to
nesse
facilitate that,
instrumento financeiro para
you
eles
put
conseguirem
this
atrair
tag
investidores.
as
E o que
sustainable
que isso
and all
quer?
these
Esse
things.
rótulo é uma
And
sinalização para os
this
investidores
tag is
de que esses recursos
a
estão
sign for
vinculados ao
investors that
projeto
these
deles
resources are
socioambientais.
linked to social and
Esse instrumento
environmental
financeiro vai ser
projects.
mobilizado
And
na
this
cooperação internacional das
financing will
finanças
be
sustentáveis como uma forma de
mobilized as
financiar
a
esse
way
gap
to
do
finance
atingimento dos
this
objetivos de desenvolvimento
gap in
sustentável e além
achieving
de segurança
the
desse mercado
millennial goals,
que tem
the
como
sustainable
créditos
development goals.
não instituições financeiras bancárias,
And
mas os
there's also, you
investidores
can get
e que
these
para, enfim,
loans
conseguir
from
atrair
non-banking
investidores
financial institutions. And
evitar
in order
evitar
to
desmonte e
attract
investir, tem certas regras de governança
the
privada,
investors, there
mas
are
que essas
certain
regras elas são voluntárias,
private governance
autorreguladas
rules
e
that
elas
must be
podem ou não
followed but in a
aderir a certas
voluntary way,
internacionais. Então,
and
as
you
finanças
can or not
sustentáveis dentro desse
adhere to them. And these
desse
sustainable finances
instrumento
within
financeiro
this
de dívida
environment
corporativa,
of
elas têm,
corporate
digamos
debt,
assim, dever
they
ser
have
autorregulatório e voluntário.
it's an outer regulatory and
Digamos,
voluntary
esses
environment.
terem, idealmente, são
And
empresas que emitem
this
essa dívida,
usually they
que
are
vão para esse
companies that
projeto
issue
deficitário,
this debt, and
seguem,
then you
digamos,
have a
uma métrica
certain
procedimental,
criteria and a
essa deveria ser
procedural
avaliada por uma
metric that
empresa
must
avaliadora que
be
faz um parceiro segundo opinião
assessed by
sobre
an
a dívida,
assessment
pode
company.
inclusive ser
We
certificado
can
como
give a
ambiental ou
second
social
party opinion, and
e tem
they
um limite
can
para
be
investidores.
certified
Mas o que a
as
gente mesmo
in
abordar
the
também aqui é que
taxonomy,
todo
and
esse
then you attract
ecossistema das finanças
investors.
sustentáveis, ele
And
faz
in
parte
this
desse sistema,
ecosystem of
é que todos esses
sustainable
atores,
finances,
eles
all of
não têm uma
these
carga
players
normativa e
do
mandatória
not
sobre eles.
have a
Então, todas
mandatory
essas etapas, elas são
normative that they should
extremamente
follow. So all of
confidenciais
these
hoje,
steps
e o que vai
do not
determinar
necessarily
o que
happen. And
acontece
what
ou
will
não são os
establish what
investidores,
will or not
porque é
happen
claro
are
que
the
dentro desse
investors
ecossistema
themselves.
são atores
So
que
if
então precisam
you're in
garantir
this
a possível
ecosystem with
financiamento.
actors that must
Mas isso é em
survive
geral.
with this
Aí, quando a
investment,
gente está
this is
falando
an
desses
overall view.
instrumentos
But when we're
de
talking
dívida
about these
corporativa para
specific
financiamento da
tools of
construção social,
corporate
fica
debt that are
altamente evidente que
financing
esses
housing
instrumentos,
sector,
especialmente no mercado
we
nacional,
have
eles
specific
não
tools in
passam da
in the
etapa,
national
mas
market
eles aterrissam
that land in pre-existing financial articulations. And these are normative arrangements that are financing the projects that would go to other investors from the FSH that with credit that comes from state banking institutions and has these official resources like the severance savings. And they have also these prerequisites in which the acquiring people use them for housing projects at a specific interest rate. And the literature mentions that the SFI would be a new layer, a more attractive layer and more modern for this market. It would be a system based on the US system, but that has never happened here in the Brazilian scenario. So we're still using the SFH and the Caixa Econômica Federal, which is a state bank. And these titles are mobilizing and financing projects for acquiring people from both the SFH and the SFI. And this is what is most relevant because we have norms in Brazil that are making this institutional change in that with the social incentivized debentures that exist since 2011, but for infrastructure projects like ports and basic sanitation. But this year's decree expanded this the concept of infrastructure to include social housing and other social projects. Today, it provides for exclusive projects implemented through PPPs, and this issuance of debentures is a corporate debt title or certificate with no taxes on it, and is mobilizing private resources for this public sector in housing. And my research made a diagnostics about what these titles are financing for. So if you have norms that incentivize the use of these certificates and to liberate this market, we have to look what are these titles and how are they constitute. And I'm going to show what these this is a very controversial way of issuance, and I will explain that. And I made a document assessment that constitute these debt and also sustainable documents about the non-governmental and sustainable documents. And to complement these documents that usually they do not tell the whole story about this issuance, I am interviewing all of these issuers. These were the 6 companies that issued these titles, including Magic that Mariana already mentioned. And when the first the investment impacting debenture investment was Vivenda, Tegra issued a debenture to build high-income buildings, but with an environmental certificate. Direcional has issued a certificate for the program Casa Verde Amarela projects, but not to build the development, but for the debt of the debt. When this debt is the value of the financing that is not under the Caixa Econômica financing that is sometimes financed by the developer and contractor themselves. So these issuances. Marcela, you have 4 minutes. Thank you. So my intention was to understand the concept of social housing, how these issuances adhere to this sustainable finances ecosystem, and how are the social environmental values are linked to that, if there's a specific clause that vinculates that, if there's any anticipated payment, or how does this non-financial mandate is included in the project, and how do we finance this in a specific way and not in a traditional way? How do these projects relate to the consolidated institutional arrangement, and what are the challenges in this market? And that is why I am doing the interviews. These are the answers that I received for my interviews. Vivenda issued a title for a reform, housing reform, Magic for social rental, Tegra for reform. And we can see that the viability of the development, they approached the traditional and banking financing, but also the ESG funds, and they tried to diversify investors.
Mas, enfim, de forma geral, assim, então, conclusões parciais.
In general, our
dessa
partial
definição é
conclusions,
tanto uma
both
lacuna
there's a
política de
gap
financiamento, então, esses
in
títulos, eles
the
são
public
financiando
policies,
que as linhas de
and
crédito
so they are
tradicionais
financing
não
the
estão financiando.
those projects that the
Mas que
traditional
também há
credit lines are
múltiplos
not
critérios,
financing,
ou
but
seja,
there's
quando essa
also
população
there are multiple
precisa de crédito,
criteria.
os
For
critérios
example, in the
impacto
Minha Casa Minha Vida program, their criteria for the low-income population is in the hands of the companies themselves. So what they are internal criteria of the companies that choose which families are eligible, and etc. You also have the issuance do not necessarily mention the ESG criteria. It's many times in the billing tools, they are not even mentioned because they're seen more as a marketing tool to attract investors and buyers. And in the end, my conclusion, the most important conclusion, is that in this change in the financial system, the housing is financed because because of the return for investment, but this return is based on the low-income population. So when the state used to receive these returns, now in this new system, this new model, we have the families bringing this return. The debt of the families is the one that brings the return. Thank you, Marcelo. Natalia and Carolina, please. Welcome.
Un momentito, porque ¿ustedes están viendo bien la pantalla?
You see my screen?
Ahí se está viendo bien la proyección del Power.
Ah, ¿está bien? Listo.
Sí.
Arranco entonces. Bueno,
I'll start then. If you can see this research that is called Providers of the Temporary Rental Market in the City of Buenos Aires, Heterogeneity, Professionalization, and Standardization, is a research that we are developing together with Natalia, and it's a concept in order to know which are the actors that participate in this providing sector, and to know what implications and social and urban terms. Our research is classified under a context of mercantilization and financiarization of housing, as we've seen before. And the work works with this global global situations and assesses impact of the short-term rental in the market of conventional rents, also the emergence of corporate players in the short-term market of rentals, and the logic of the small providers in the short-term rental, and also the impact of this kind of rental in the market. The research, in our case, tries to characterize the provider and analyzing the strategies, and in order to understand how they work and characterize it of this short-term rental and its impact in conventional rental market. And then we've made interviews and we assessed several websites and the managers and the actors and other events in the sector, and analysis of inside an Airbnb, the platforms.
Algunos datos sobre el alcance del mercado de alquileres
Some
temporarios
information
en
about the
Buenos Aires.
short-term rental market in Buenos Aires. Well, the first registers of the Airbnb activities began in 2010, and from there on, the market has grown, especially including the pandemic years, except in the pandemic years, and 90% correspond to complete apartments, and the rest 10% are rooms in shared houses. The other figure is that the distribution of short-term rentals reproduces the valuation of the cities. Most of them are concentrated in the northern and central part of the city that are more valued, and there's a trend to concentrate the management. For example, in 2022, 50% of offer was managed through several platforms. And this year that has increased to 62%. We also observe a polarization between those sectors that have only one property and the top hosts that have more than 11 houses. And we also see a professionalization trend when you have managers managing more units. We also see this deregulation trend in the market. In Argentina, the conventional rental market is liberalized, and the short-term rental market in Buenos Aires has a very weak law and is not really followed. And 60% of offers is on BRB and it's registered, but they do not really follow the rule. We also organize the actors, the providers in the market. We separated them between owners, managers, and managers. The logic of the owners, we see that they have rentier and logic and the entrepreneurship, and their main they seek to have the most income with the less work. And there's also this aggression between the short-term and the conventional markets. They are competing depending on what the situation at the moment. And they try to have the higher income with the less work possible. You have three main activities to outsource the management, to avoid commissions and longer stays, to have a higher income, they capture more income and have more control over on their property, but that requires more work. And these common characteristics have also identified that the social economical characteristics of this kind of rental can be characterized in three sets. We have those owners that through this income, they complement their income through this rental. Those owners that try to maintain a medium class condition of life, and that is done through these rentals. And they have the multi owners that aim to capitalize their properties through these short-term rentals. All this affects the way the short-term rentals are thought, and it is important to start to think about these regulations based on these characteristics. So talking about the managers, we've identified two groups. One, the independent hosts that are not capitalized, and they use the hosting as an opportunity to complement their income. They do not dedicate completely to that. It's a non-professionalized logic, and they work with Airbnb or Booking. And they do this work in a very simple manner as a complementation to their jobs and other activities, just as an income complementation activity. And we have the corporate managers, which they have different trajectories and different sizes, and the difference is they are capitalized and professionalized. They have a brand, they start a website, they have social networks and offices and employees, and they have their own platforms. Within these corporate managers, we see that
es esto, ¿no? Que tienen como una gran
they have
de estos gestores, perdón. Ah, acá está, me estaba hablando de esto, de los gestores
okay,
corporativos.
here we go. Well, we can see that they are professionalized, and the more professionalized they are, we also see more territorial concentration. They have better working conditions for their employees, and there's not so pulverized. They seek more technification, more, and they follow the rules and the regulations better, because that they think they can benefit from that. So because then they will kind of filter the market, and only those that are really apt and capable would be in the market. There's and
Permiso,
we also,
Carolina, 4 minutos.
Carolina, you have 4 minutes. Okay. We also identified 2 sub-markets focusing on the that are that are linked to the hotel and tourism sector, and also another more flexible and rental sub-market in for people that come to the cities to stay a little bit longer. We have also the build to rent to try to attract the contractors through the model, and we see that this model, and we can see this in other cities in Latin America and in Buenos Aires, are not so they're trying to attract the contractors to build for this kind of rental market, but that's not happening because it's associated to it works more for diversifying investors and to convert this kind of developments with this flexible diversified schemes in which those developers are associated with corporate managers to offer this service of short-term rentals.
And we are going to leave a lot of time for the findings because we think that's interesting to share. Nati?
Bueno, entonces, para cerrar,
Well, to conclude, 3 ideas that we think are the central ideas that allowed us to do this analysis of actors to get to know the temporary rent market in Buenos Aires. First, the heterogeneity in the offer of temporary rent. It seems interesting to us to think about this, considering that many times the literature is absent in the discussion of this heterogeneity, and the focus is put on especially corporate actors, but we want to reflect on this heterogeneity. A second point is the trend to professionalize the manager and the concentration of territory. Like Carolina said, as the intercapitalist competence moves forward, this process becomes more professionalized and the services become less genuine and follow global practices, and this includes territory concentration that reinforces the traditional territorial patterns. And the professionalized managers tried to lead the developers of models of this type, but without success in the case of Buenos Aires. And thirdly, what we saw is that we have 2 models in temporary rent, one short-term that we call hospitality rent, and another one medium-term that we call flexible prolonged rent. And both models have differentiated logics for management, and they also respond to different types of demand. Temporary rent for temporary rent, which is also interesting to explore more deeply because we believe that in order to understand the rent market in general, it's already necessary to think about temporary rent as a modality beyond tourism rent. And what we see is that temporary rent models, any of the two, represent a problem for access to housing in Buenos Aires for two reasons. First, the conventional rent contracts have as a floor the potential income that they would get from temporary rent, which causes the rent market in general to have a raise in prices in the cities. And secondly, because the model of temporary rent that is happening through the developers in other cities, in other forms of organization like co-living and co-working, creates a type of housing that does not adjust to the local housing demands. And that's what we wanted to share. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Obrigado. Vou chamar o
Thank
Santiago
you.
agora.
I will now invite Santiago. Welcome, Santiago.
Hola, ¿me escuchan bien?
Hello, can you hear
Sim.
me well? Yes.
Hola. Bueno, mi nombre es Santiago Echarri.
Well, my name is Santiago Echari. Thank you very much for the space and for the organizers and to the organizers of this event. I think it's very interesting to hear from the different forms of financialization that exist in the different Latin American countries. And while I will talk about the Mexican context, specifically the two new actors that have arisen for the production of housing that is rent-based. I would like to start with this collage, because in this collage, we see represented all the different forms of production and management of housing that exist in Mexico, where, like in many Latin American countries, the high production of housing has been the main way to access housing for a large part of the population, and that the promotion of housing in a form of ownership has been the strategy that the government and the real estate market have chosen to offer housing. And in the last few decades, rent has regained its strength as a mechanism to access housing. And this is related, on the one hand, with the fact that the costs for construction materials has increased, the cost of land has increased, and the loss of purchasing power of the citizens, and rent has become a new strength in the real estate market. My presentation orbits around these two axes that have as a central focus rent-based living. On the one hand, I am interested in the financialized landlords that are these big financial instruments that have financialized housing in the specific case of Mexico, and that have, and on the other hand, I will talk about the emergency in the Mexican state of starting to promote housing through a rent-based scheme. Historically, the Mexican government had attempted to solve the housing crisis through property living and, and owning houses. And in the last year, it has started announcing public housing projects that are rent-based. And the emergence of this in both sectors, both the public and private, is very interesting. It is an undeniable demonstration that rent is becoming increasingly relevant as a way to access housing all over the world, and especially in the Mexican case. Santiago, could you speak a little bit closer to the mic? Yes, of course. Talking about financialization processes in Mexico, it's a paradox. According to Jeff Orwell's work, Mexico is a sub-financialized country, but that has started presenting financialization processes, especially in the real estate sector, and specifically through the legal figure of the fibras. The fibras, we have comparable examples in many countries, in like Brazil, European countries, but its origin was in the US as the real estate investment trusts that in Mexico has taken on a similar form. Basically, fibras are real estate portfolios that gather many real estate properties and that are listed in the stock exchange market. So they're listed like a company, like Facebook, and they have a portfolio because they have many properties that are rent-based, and they receive proper profit from the rent that is paid for these houses. And it's very interesting that ever since the fibras became formalized in the Mexican stock exchange market and in the Mexican legislation, ever since 2011, the fibras have only grown in the country. Currently, we have 16 fibras that are listed in the Mexican stock exchange market, and it's important to say that they represent 10% of all of the companies, the public companies in the stock exchange market of Mexico. And even though it's just 10%, it's very interesting to observe the difference, the percentage difference in actors that participate in the fibras with respect, if compared to the actors that participate as investors in the other companies that are listed in the stock exchange market in Mexico. In the other companies, especially the investors are foreign actors, and a smaller percentage, the development funds for Mexican workers, and a very small percentage of individuals like ourselves that invest their own money in these companies. However, in the fibras sector, the participation is divided between three almost equal parts. And this is very interesting because the individuals, like us, normal people, have become very interested in investing their money in the fibras or in the financialization of real estate. And this also shows that financialization has a cultural aspect that is very much intrinsic to society. People really trust real estate investments. And this is due to the fact that real estate has always been considered as collateral assets and a very safe investment. And it's also very interesting that the Afores, the development funds, worker funds, are more interested in investing in the fibras than in other financial sectors. And this possibly is related to the same thing. The fibras, like I said, we have 16 currently listed, but 7 have a significant participation in the city of Mexico. And here we see a map of the city where we have the main points where we have the main housing complexes in the fibras. And here we have a cell phone that shows us how you can buy fragments of real estate, pieces of real estate in the city, and obtain monthly profits through the certificates people purchase. If we organize the spatial location of the fibras, we have very interesting patterns in this form of investment that show the way that they're concentrated in financialized real estate that have a spatial pattern that's very relevant. And it's also important to highlight that the same spatial pattern coincides with the spatial pattern of the value of land. So in dark blue and in light blue, we have the most expensive land values in the city. For a minute, Santiago, and this is very similar to the geographic location of the fibras. These are the two projects, the ones in pink that are promoting for the first time how rent-based living, because the other ones are for shops, commercial purposes, or workshops, and we have a public program here for housing, and it's important to highlight that the rent-based living promoted by the fibras are 10 times more than the ones provided by public living. And these are the differences between the projects. The scale in this sense is no less important because the fibras are conditioned to granting economic profit to its investors. So they need to resort to a very large scale architecture that is achieved through an exception type of architecture planning. So the fibras change the urban planning with innovative large-scale projects that provide for more profits for the investors, both national and international. Also promoting a more generic form of living to be able to be replicated and standardized. And they have an architecture that is not very much integrated to its urban surroundings. And also the fibras, like we see, it's very interesting. They're interested in directly intervening in the value of land. And it's interesting that the Mexican fibras have decided to invest in the building of a park in a land that should have been used for the building of social housing in order to maintain the added value for that land around the properties and the real estate. The eruption of these types of enterprises around the cities has been done in a very aggressive manner and has caused many social conflicts through the eviction and the construction of the very responsible construction that has many irregularities of several large-scale projects that are very disruptive to the lives of normal citizens. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Obrigado, Santiago. Muito bom.
Thank you, Santiago. Very
Bom,
good.
Muito
Well,
obrigado a todas as
thank
apresentações.
you to
Eu vou passar
all
agora para a
panelists.
Lúcia. A gente
I will
tem
now pass the floor
hora
to
de
Lucia.
debate.
We
Então,
have an
você
hour
pode fazer com
to
calma
debate, so
suas
Lucia,
considerações.
you may
Bem-vinda.
calmly make your comments and welcome.
Obrigada, Felipe. E obrigada, eu
Thank
queria
you,
agradecer à
Felipe,
LabCidade
and
pelo
I would like to
convite
thank
para participar do
LabCidades for
seminário
inviting me
nesse
to
tema
participate in
que
this
me é tão
seminar
caro. E também queria
on a
agradecer a
topic that's so dear
apresentação
to me. And I'd also like to thank
dos
our
outros, excelentes
panelists.
apresentações,
You had
tanto,
excellent
né, os
presentations to
resultados de uma
share,
pesquisa de fôlego que vocês
both
vêm
with the
traçando, como
result
também com
of
a clareza da
a research that
apresentação.
you have been doing,
Parabéns.
and you are all also very
Eu
clear
preparei
in
aqui
your
o
exposés.
eu vou tentar cumprir o meu tempo dado,
I will try and
10 a
stick to
12
my
minutos de
allotted time,
comentários gerais e algumas questões
between 10 and
específicas para
12
os
minutes of general
apresentadores,
comments
para depois
and some
abrir ao debate.
specific
Eu já vi que tem
questions,
algumas
and then
perguntas aqui no
open
chat,
the
mas a
floor for
ideia
the
é
debate.
realmente
I think there
a
are some
discussão
questions in the
coletiva.
chat, and the idea is for us to have a
Da minha
collective
parte,
discussion.
então, em termos
On my part,
de problema
in terms of a common issue identified in the four presentations, we can see the advance of the frontier of accumulation of real estate and financial capital in the provision of rent-based living in the different modalities that were presented here, including social housing, social rent, temporary rent, social housing for low-income families, and in the Mexican case, even for students. But if I were to stop my intervention in these terms, it would be a shame because the work that you did goes beyond this generic statement that I just made. I think the four works went deeper into some dimensions that are very important. First, obviously, each one in different degrees, depending on the cases analyzed, but some common issues emerge that I like to highlight here so that we can better understand this coordination between rent-based living, the capital market, and public policies. First, the importance of the role of the state, both in regulating and in structuring these emerging markets. And then it became very clear to me when I heard what you had to say and when I read your abstracts, the need to qualify and define or ascertain what we are referring to when we say regulation, both public regulation and what we could refer to as a private regulation based on the conventions and norms that market actors implement. So I think this is a first issue that emerged when I read and when I heard your presentations.
The second is the relevance of what Mariana called these intermediary players. And I would like to expand a little bit more than Mariana in order to think about the intermediation between the service providers, in the case of rental service providers, and the real estate developers, which sometimes they appear as intermediaries and sometimes not. And we're going to make this relationship between the demand, financial investors, and the contractors. And these players are very diversified. They might be private, public, profit or non-profit. So there's a wide range of types of intermediary players in this provision market for rental, and also the different financial structures that are being organized to fund this production, but not only to finance it, but also to allow these direct and indirect appropriation of financial gains, either through the interest rates from this lent capital or on the debt certificate ownership or on the income that arises from the rental and the ownership of the financial certificates. These structures are mobilized both to fund the production, the building of new units for rental, and also this direct and indirect appropriation of financial gains and in this production and circulation of capital and funds. Then all of this varies according to the case presented. And in my opinion, the cases that were analyzed by Mariana and other cities, the debt certificates and the fibras that Santiago spoke about, we may say that these are financialized structures. They pass through the capital markets, either as certificates and titles or stock exchange or in companies listed in the stock exchange. In Buenos Aires, that was not made so clear, and I have a question about this for Carolina, to know that if corporate owners and these corporate managers are associated to the capital market or not. Another issue is that there are some trends that point to the rental market are very common to what was analyzed in the first wave of studies about the banking financialization in Brazil, especially in the housing and the economic sector. We have a standardization of this product, of standardization of products and of their architectural structure. We've also see the concentration in some actors or players and their need for them to capitalize, linked or not to the financial market. And there's a tendency of a selective geography with the prioritization of certain areas that may serve to a public that has a higher or a less risk of default. So this is very interesting because we see a new niche for the rental market, but it's common tendencies of companies and investors for provision in this market. And another thing I would like to highlight is the quality of the method and the methodological strategy of all the works that makes us clearly see the specificities and the differences, but also the overall trends of this emerging market. So I would like to once again congratulate all of you. And I'd like to make a contribution to the seminar that these articles point to the tendency that goes against what a social rental public policy as a universal right is. And in the end, this is a constitution of new products and rental services like flexible, short-term, and student rentals that will expand financial gains in this provision structure that are appropriated privately, even when you have this social and environmental appeal. So in fact, we are walking towards financialization, other financialization markets. That is the central topic of this seminar. I will take a few minutes to put some overall and some specific questions to all of you. Well, this question goes to all of you because it's a general question for us to think about this theoretical referential that is being mobilized, especially in the role of the impact and social finances. Mariana showed us these two trends, one that is most pro-market, in which social finances play or they're going to fill the gap as a solution and adjustment to solve social and environmental problems. So it's finances as a solution. And another one that is more critical in accounting and geography that says, yes, we agree that this solution only legitimizes the financialized capital, but it is justified because there's a new logic in relation to solving the poverty problems and the regulation of natural resources when we approach the environmental agenda. And as Marcela said, we saw how fragile is the assessment of these requirements and criteria in these financialized initiatives by the financial market, and how it is weak and fragile to assess these criteria. And considering our objective in the seminar, that is to contribute in the formulation of public policies on social rental, when we have these limits that are imposed by the states and by the fiscal austerity, and we see in the part of the literature is the solution through finances. I don't think I would like to put this out there as food for thought, and I would like to know how you deal with these contradictions in the academic environment in your work. And now about specific issues for Mariana. I think that both for Mariana and for Marcela, I think the regulation issues are very strong in your work. In the summary of your work, you say that in Brazil, the state is not so present in the rental market with these social impact finances. And I would like you to think is it true that there is is the state not present, or is it just not as present as in the European cases? But have you thought about the verifications that would incentivize that presence? Marcela's work talks about the debentures, the incentivized social debentures. So maybe we can try to expand and try to assess with the norms and the guidelines and bills of law in the federal and state level that might incentivize this indirect participation in the formulation of these instruments and legislation. So I would like you to please comment more on that role and presence of the state. And Marcela, you said that in this ecosystem, and this is a very interesting allusion as to ecosystem as an adaptation of these structures. This ecosystem will adapt to these initiatives. You state that there is a lack of regulation. And seeking to expand this regulation idea, thinking of the governing through instruments, can we say that these practices or market conventions, or as you say, private rules will serve as regulation? And so I would like you to comment a little bit more on this issue, please. And your presentation reinforced how this open gap opened by debentures and the real estate receivable titles is similar to that gap between that hybrid breach we had in the Minha Casa Minha Vida program when contractors appropriated the subsidized interest rate for the demand of the lower economic sector. They appropriated those gaps, and now the same companies, MERV and others, that will appropriate these social incentivized debentures as well, that they were directed towards infrastructure and now are being adapted to social housing. So if you could comment a little bit more on that. The landslide, if you have more information on this arena that has been constituted in order to include housing in what is being called, what is the definition of social infrastructures that are present in this decree? For Natalia and Carolina, and also for Santiago, I have a few questions in relation to the dimension of the players in your works. In the case of Buenos Aires, I was in doubt whether you showed the diversity of all these players, and I would like to know if in these multi-owners and these corporate managers, what is their link with the capital markets? Did you verify if they are open capital, if they are public companies, or if they have investors involved, if they are related to the capital markets, who are the investors that are buying these certificates, these titles? What is the link that you have seen with the short-term capital market and the financialization processes? And lastly, for Santiago, I would like you to please comment a little bit more about the topic of the seminar, the social rental, what you call the public social rent. When you talked about this initiative that is directed towards students, I would like you to please tell us a little bit more about the players that are involved in these two FIBRAs projects that are directed towards housing. If you could please highlight a little bit more, because we have little literature about these housing FIBRAs projects, especially those that are directed towards rent. Those were my comments, and I'd like to thank you, and I
obrigado.
apologize if I took
Vamos na
more
ordem,
time than I should.
Mariana, por favor.
Okay, so let's start answering. Mariana, you go first. Thank you. Thank you for the comments. I took note of a few questions in relation to the theoretical reference and the role of the finances. We see that these capital market agents that are operating in these structures, they have a very progressive discourse. They are capital market agents with a more progressive view and with more progressive discourse, saying that we can join our efforts in order to improve what is being offered. This social finances discourse is very attractive for these agents, but in relating to the presence of the state here, we really do not have this direct presence. It's more in the regulation of these instruments related to the capital markets. And in Brazil, but also around the world, there is no regulation on how these social impacts may be calculated. So even if we do have some kind of movement in Brazil revolving around the impact bonds and trying to create some regulation, the state is not so close to this finance market and social, more than in the social issues.
Obrigado, Mariana.
Thank you, Mariana. Marcela, please.
Bom, obrigada, Lucia, pelas perguntas. Eu acho
Thank
que a
you,
questão da
Lucia.
regulação,
I think that
ela é
the
importante.
topic of regulation is very important, and this dimension that you talked about, to say that the state is non-participant, is a very different view, because in the case of Magic, for example, the Soma development is there to say that we have these developments for the low-income population that comes from a filed this initiative is not the whole story, because we understand that that specific place has a specific target audience, and we also have the financial information if they're organizing through the CV and the securities or to other regulations. There's a specific regulation for that, but the dimension that is to attribute to this financial tool a non-financial obligation that is of social impact or to achieve the SDGs, there really is no regulation for that. They have this self-regulation by the players themselves, which is, like I said, an ecosystem, and it's not mandatory. So in the case of Magic, for example, this issuance did not have a second opinion issues an OPI, but the Gaia security company said they spoke to the to the investors, and they said that the impact is seen straight in the development. I do not have to have these consultancies because we'll see the social impact is the development themselves. I'm not sure, I can't say if that is right or wrong, but the tools that this market created are not really present in all issuances. So regulation is a complex topic, and also on about what Paula asked, the interest of market alternatives to the FGTS. Yes, investors have shown this interest to be more autonomous in relation to the FGTS, especially because the FGTS has these ties and requirements that are related to this traditional financing. It's a traditional tool with these traditional requirements. And there's also the issue that the Caixa Econômica Federal itself has mobilized to be more participant, and they are starting to issue a sustainable corporate debt bond, and they have been creating a tool with specific companies, securities companies, and this participation of Caixa Econômica Federal and these players is based on can we do this mediation? We have a pessimistic and an optimistic literature. And when we join both, there is optimism because there's this appetite by the market. We have investors that have capital to invest and they want to invest in this. And then we have to just enjoy the opportunity. It says we see that in Gaia, they want to take advantage of this appetite and of this investment in ESG funds, and with investors that want to have this brand, this impact on their portfolio. And we also have the social investment. The normative history is complex because the social incentivized debentures come in a set that in 2023 that were the structured measures for credit that were for housing, for example, or construction. You can have the fiduciary lend, and we want to bring more credit for this market.
So first, in 2023, there was a first decree that the writing with several projects to increase infrastructure was not specifically for PPP. So there was social housing, parks, schools, but there was no specific provision for PPPs. This year, there was a new decree that also talked about PPPs exclusively for social housing. So in the other projects, there is the possibility to issue a debenture without interaction with the public power, but for social housing, that's not possible. And that's another point that I'd like to investigate and interview someone about. But currently, the debate is that the social housing project that will be implemented in Recife will be electable for a social incentivized debenture. And since it's a project that was a decree that was just issued this year, there have been no debentures issued yet. So these projects that I presented are not considered as social incentivizing debentures. And I think that's what I had to say. Thank you. Great, Marcela. And just to clarify to the public, Marcela also answered a question that Paula Santoro, a professor here in the architecture course of the University of São Paulo, asked in the Zoom chat. She mentioned Raquel's lecture on Tuesday, and she asked if the market agents that are elaborating these strategies are concerned with alternatives to the FGTS, one of the main real estate credit fundings in Brazil that are like a mandatory savings account for formal workers in Brazil. But after the round is over, I will mention the questions in the chat more calmly, and then you can add to your answers if you want.
Bueno, voy a retomar primero la pregunta
Well,
respecto a la
first,
financiarización.
I will talk about the
Efectivamente, en el caso de Buenos Aires,
financiarization effectively in the
tenemos
case of
realidades
Buenos
particulares,
Aires,
podría extenderlo a Argentina, pero
and
los factores
well,
agregados que nosotros
we
venimos
did not
estudiando
extend it to Argentina, but we could.
no son actores
The
financiarizados en el
actors
sentido de que
involved are not financialized
por eso
actors in the
nosotros
sense
en el
that,
titulamos el trabajo hablando de heterogeneidad,
and that's why we
profesionalización y
called
estandarización y
the
no
work
hablamos de
the
financiarización,
heterogeneity
porque
and the
son actores que
professionalization and
no reciben el básico
standardization, but we didn't talk
complementario,
about
sino que reciben
financialization
beneficios
because these are
institucionales,
actors
tampoco
that
cotizan
don't
en
have
bolsa, digo, no son
institutional
empresas
funds
que
that
se
are
han
not
ido
listed in
creando
the exchange
locales,
market,
que han
but
ido
these are
creciendo, que han
local
generado
companies
propiedades,
that
que han
have
ido
been
construyendo
growing, that have
portafolios
accumulated
corporativos,
property,
pero no tienen vínculo con los
and that
departamentales.
have corporate
Esto
managers,
es
but they are
interesante
not
para poder
linked to the
entender esto
capitals
y
market.
entender un poco la particularidad
And
de Argentina y
to
el mercado
understand
inmobiliario
this,
de
we need to
Argentina, donde
understand
no,
the
salvo algunas excepciones,
specificity of the
no
real
hay
estate
fondos
market in
institucionales,
Argentina,
ese es uno de
where
de
we
los
don't
dramas que los
have
desarrolladores identifican, ¿no?
institutional
con respecto al
funds.
mercado inmobiliario
And
en
this is one
Argentina,
of
y
the
es uno de los motivos
problems
también
that
por
the
los cuales
developers
esta idea
identify
que
for the growth
buscan
of the
implementar, ¿no?
Argentinian
de creación
market.
de modelos de business model,
And
de edificios que sean destinados
this
justamente a la
is
renta,
also
con
part of a
bonos de renta,
historic
etcétera, no
process
han permeado porque los inversores son
that
inversores
has
particulares.
not existed because the
Y esto
investors
tiene que
are
ver, por un lado, con un factor más
private
macroeconómico de la
investors.
situación de Argentina
And
a
this
nivel
is related to
internacional,
a
con
more
dificultades típicas para acceder al
macroeconomic
capital para el proceso de
factor, the
endeudamiento,
difficulty
¿no?
that
Los
Argentina
inversores
has to
no
access
suceden porque
the
van a
capitals
formar
market because of its
sobre todo
indebtedness,
durante los
and
últimos años,
something you
lo que va a
probably
pasar ahora
know
con
about,
un
especially in the last few
gestión del
years,
gobierno
and what's
nacional
going
que
to
está mucho
happen
más
now with the national
intentando,
management
digamos, que Argentina ingrese a ese mercado de
that has
capitales.
been attempting
Por el
to
otro lado,
add
también gran
Argentina
parte
to
de los
the capitals
inversores
market.
que
But on the other
están,
hand,
que participan de estos desarrollos
part of the
son
investors
inversores
that participate in
que
these
manejan
developments
una
are
economía en negro, digamos, una economía del mercado
investors
inmobiliario en
that
Argentina, en Buenos Aires,
are
es una economía que está muy por fuera, digamos,
involved in
de lo
the
regulado,
informal
está muy
economy.
irregular.
The real estate
Entonces,
market
ese dinero, digamos,
in
nunca,
Argentina is very
no pasa
informal and it's not
por estados
very
federales, que es así, no
regularized.
circula por muchas
So
partes.
this money
Entonces,
does not
inversores grandes,
go through the formal
empresas,
market, and
vienen,
the
digamos, de
goes through
excedentes de
other
otras áreas, de
spaces
industria, del agro, etcétera,
like
pero se canalizan
businesses and
principalmente al mercado
industries, but
directamente
they're
al desarrollo
funneled
de inmuebles para no
directly to the
pasar
development
por un
of
proceso de
real estate
blanqueo,
so
digamos,
as
por no
not to
ingresar de
go
raíz
through a
por eso. De hecho, ha habido en los
laundering
últimos años algunas
process.
políticas para promover la
And
creación de fondos
th-
de
a
inversión
few years
específicamente
ago, there
destinados
were
a
policies
desarrollos
to
inmobiliarios,
create
algo similar,
investment
pero con
funds
mucho
related
alcance al que hablaba
to real
Santiago,
estate market,
y no han
something
tenido
similar
éxito por eso.
to what Santiago said, but
Obviamente
they
que hay
didn't
algunos actores del
succeed because of
mercado,
this. So there
desarrolladores más
are some
grandes que
market
sí cotizan en
actors
bolsa,
and
etcétera,
developers that
que
are
no solamente
bigger
están participando
that are
acá, sino
listed
de
in the
desarrolladores,
exchange
y después
market, but
tenemos
these are not the ones
mediadores y
that are
cómo
present here
trabajar
in
con
terms
compañías
of
más grandes que
developers.
tienen cierta capacidad de
And
capital, etcétera, para llevar a cabo este tipo de
we
desarrollos. Y el mismo puede ser en Argentina,
we
lo
have
hacen en
talked
otros países, lo hacen en
to
Estados Unidos, lo hacen en
developers
Uruguay,
that are
no lo hacen
bigger
en Buenos
and they
Aires
choose not
porque
to do
justamente
this
lo
in
tienen que hacer
Argentina.
y el
They
motivo por
don't
el que
do
no lo
this
hacen
in
tiene que ver con
Argentina, and
la
the
seguridad
reason
jurídica
why
y
they don't
esto
do
que no
it
tienen
is
inversores
the
poderosos,
legal
poderosos griegos
security
para
and the
invertir
fact
en
that they
negro,
don't
etcétera.
have
Entonces,
investors that
ese
want
es el
to
gran
run that
motivo,
risk.
digamos, por la
So
particularidad,
this is the
digamos, en el
main
caso
reason in the
acá de Buenos Aires
specificity of our
y obviamente
case
que
here in
nosotros
Buenos
tenemos más.
Aires.
Sí, bueno, gracias, Lucia, por
Yes,
la lectura atenta
thank you,
y por los
Lucia,
comentarios.
for your
No, sumando a
attentive
esto que
reading and
trae
for your
Carolina,
comments, and adding to what
por un lado, la
Carolina
única beta que
said.
sí todavía no
On
está
the one
establecida,
hand,
pero
the
que creemos que hay algo vinculado a la
one
internacionalización
path that
de los
we
flujos
didn't really
de las rentas,
explore
tiene que ver con
is
las
that there is an
modalidades y que utilizan
internationalization
la
of
gran
flows, and
mayoría de los
income is
canales
related to the
que se dan
modality
a
that
través
is
de
used by
plataformas,
the main
que es el cobro a través de billeteras
owners
virtuales.
that
Estas billeteras virtuales, como puede
rent
ser
out
PayPal, Wise, etcétera,
their
sí
properties, do so
aparecen como
using
instrumentos
online
para
platforms
poder
like PayPal and
agarrar
etc.
inversores,
And they appear like
que es
instruments
algo importante en
to
Argentina, digamos, algo que se valora, que este tipo
to list
digamos,
the property for rent
los
in
alquileres temporarios
dollars,
se
which is
generan una renta
important
en dólares y
here
esa
in
renta en dólares es una
Argentina
cuestión que
because
no
of
voy a
the
detallar,
currency
se pierde mucho
issues that I
dinero
won't
cuando
go
uno lo especifica, lo pasa a moneda
into
local
detail about.
y digamos, aparecen estas billeteras
It-
como las maneras
so
de resguardar
these platforms are a form to secure the dollarized income of temporary rent at the international level. What we know, we don't know where these platforms invest these funds, and this is effectively money that's leaving Argentina. It's an income that does not stay in Argentina, and while the owners used it either as investment or when they made international purchases or trips, but they are not invested in Argentina. So this is something that should perhaps be explored, and that's related to these platforms, and which is interesting when we talk about the specificity that Carolina mentioned if compared to more complex global markets. And I'd also like to add about the general comments that you made in your first comments, something that is related to this advance in the accumulation of capital through the platforms. We have seen this specifically in the case of the rent of the complete house, of the entire house, because the trend that we detect both in Santiago de Chile and in Buenos Aires, when we leave the more consolidated and touristic neighborhoods, housing, rent-based housing becomes an option that is very expressive in terms of offer. And that's when we see that it's interesting to explore beyond the more general trends of rent-based living. When we talk about the accumulation of capital, we are also talking about new urban spaces that are becoming mercantilized. In this case, the domestic sphere that seem to be perhaps the safer space in the cities, that was safer from the threat of capital. So our free time, our additional lodging are now spaces that can also be mercantilized. And this idea is also interesting to explore. And a last issue about the question about the role of the state is about the regulation or deregulation. At first, we thought about the idea that our rent market was deregulated since a couple of months ago with the arrival of Javier Milei, but the idea is not that it's deregulated, it is liberalized. There is a regulation that is playing, where the state is playing an active role trying to favor capital. And this seems very interesting to me, that we stop thinking about the market as deregularized, but actually think about a liberalization of the market, and that's a political decision with legal instruments. So thank you for also bringing this idea to be debated, and thank you for the space, and this is a wonderful panel.
Obrigado. Santiago, por favor.
Thank you, Santiago. Hello. Well, first, thank you, Lucia, for your questions, and to connect the first question that you asked with the questions that were made on YouTube about the participation of the FIBRA in the housing and rent market. I think it should be said first that there is no literature or any academic work about rent-based living promoted by FIBRAs, because this year, it's very recent that it was announced the participation of FIBRAs in the rent-based housing market. So it's very recent. The FIBRAs had only participated in industrial, commercial properties. Why? Because the actors that participate in the rent of these pieces of real estate are usually institutional actors that have 10-year or more contracts, and have the perception of more security. However, like many authors have mentioned in the panels in the seminar, the last frontier of financialization is housing because of the inherent characteristics of housing as a main need for all human beings. And this justifies the entry of fibras this year in the housing market. And it's very interesting because this year it was announced that the fibras would enter the the rent housing market, and at the same time it was announced that the government of the city of Mexico will start building a public housing program that is rent based. So it's very interesting that both actors that we are talking about, the market and the state, in the same year decided to invest in rent based housing as an instrument for profit and also as an instrument to give access to housing. And this shows that rent is becoming a paramount topic in the Mexican sphere that is not sufficiently regulated or reflected on. And to talk a little bit more about the rent-based living for young people in the city of Mexico, it's important to mention that this program came after a failure of a previous public policy that tried to build accessible housing for rent. In the previous administration, it was promoted a public program that was very interesting called PRUBI, a program of urban rehabilitation and inclusive housing that didn't have the direct participation of the state in the construction of the housing, but the state provided fiscal incentives and construction incentives to the real estate actors so that they would separate a percentage of the housing built so that it would be more accessible in terms of rent prices. But in 4 years of this program, not a single building was delivered under that scheme because the real estate actors don't want to participate. They think that the profit of participating in that type of scheme is not competitive enough if compared to the profit that they lose. And it's based on that failure that they weren't able to convince the real estate market to produce accessible housing that the state decided to directly engage in building the housing in a rent-based scheme. So this is very interesting because starting now, we will start seeing a tension in the city of Mexico between main real estate funds that have the power to control the prices of land versus a direct intervention from the state. And the backdrop is an interest in regulating and decreasing the exponential increase of the cost of living in the city of Mexico and also in the cost of land.
Obrigado, Santiago. Santiago foi
Great. Thank you,
respondendo já
Santiago.
pergunta da Nath
Santiago
Lelis
also
no,
answered
no
Nachi
chat do YouTube,
Lelis'
né?
question
Perguntou sobre as fibras.
in the YouTube chat. She asked about the
E,
fibras.
bom, acho que todos esperamos aí
Well,
alguma
I
publicação
think
sobre essas
we're
mudanças,
all
esses
expecting a
acontecimentos recentes
publication
no
about the
México. Se você
recent
for descrever
uh,
algo, a gente tem super interesse,
developments
principalmente essa
in
questão da
Mexico. So if you're
sincronicidade,
going
né?
to write something about
Entre
this, we're very
a questão das
interested,
fibras
especially the
do
synchronicity
Estado
between
com relação às
the
vendas
action of the
de renda.
fibras
Eu vou
and
ler agora
the
outras
state in
perguntas, né,
terms
Paula?
of the
Passando agora para os
rent-based
grupos de
housing.
perguntas. A
I'll
própria Nath
read some
Lelis
other questions
fez
asked
uma
by Paula
pergunta
Santoro
para todos.
and also Nachi
Na verdade, é um
Lelis.
pouco do que a Lúcia já
And this is
finalizou
a little bit of
a
what
fala dela,
Lucia
pensando no papel do
just
Estado, quais os
answered,
principais elementos
thinking about the role of
normativos,
the state. What
leis,
are the
regulamentos
main
e programas
normative
que
elements,
têm impacto
laws,
nesses
regulations,
processos e como eles
policies,
se
and
relacionam
programs
com as normas
that have
gerais?
impact in these
Isso já foi
processes, and
em
how
boa
do they
parte
relate to
respondido,
the
mas
general norms. I think this was already answered, but if anyone wants to complement, and Paula asked directly to Mariana the following question. I'll read. In João Chavoni's work that we saw is in one of your references, we had as a hypothesis that these businesses are still philanthropic and they are an option to philanthropy, a significant alternative in terms of land regularization. Do you think these businesses would survive without philanthropic support? And if yes, are they trying to receive support from the state or from public policies? I ask because we are discussing rent-based policies, and will these projects gain scale? To Marcela, Paulo wants to know a bit more about the relationship with the PPPs. And I add here what you said in the end of your intervention about an ongoing coordination with what's going on in Recife. You mentioned that there would be a relationship with the issuing of social impact bonds. And if you could talk more about this, because in previous sessions we had presentations about the Recife policy, and this did not come up. So if you could complement. And lastly, well, also for Marcela, Paula asks, well, all of these businesses are based on the indebtedness of families and individuals and of transactioning that debt in the market through debentures. How does that debt impact Black families, single mothers? Because debt causes eviction and people to lose their housing. So if anyone, or perhaps everyone, wants to talk a little bit about this topic, these are the questions in the chat. And if Lucia wants to complement with her own question, we're moving on to a final round, and then we will conclude.
I just wanted to complement, building on the questions that I had mentioned, this landslide of social infrastructures in order to incorporate and include housing. I would like to know how these companies were able to avoid and to know that if in the decree is it provided for that you need specifically a PPP, and how did these companies were able to access these bonds without the PPP. And also something I didn't mention this the issue of indebtedness, but I think it is crucial for these processes to show the debt as a flow of financial flows, and on the other hand, the family debt and this increase in processes in eviction because of social inequalities. Thank you. Okay, let's try to keep our time limit in 3 or 4 minutes for our final remarks, and then we'll end our panel. Okay, thank you for all your questions, Paula. I will answer using Soma as an example because it is already in the incubation stage and we have these answers. In the case of Soma, they until now haven't identified any form of direct participation of the state in the financing or in any policy that they have used. They really worked through the capital markets and financial institutions, and there was no philanthropy, because what happened was that the companies that entered as investors, they also participated in the construction, offering their products like Gerdau and other companies. So they offered their products at a more affordable price, but it wasn't philanthropy. It was just a more affordable product, and yes, they entered also as investors. And at Soma, they have this view of building 11 more buildings in the central neighborhood of São Paulo. And in the as the financial market actors, they think that it is possible to do this articulation in order to build these new buildings, new developments, and not necessarily to gain scale, but to be able to achieve and serve more families. And this impact on families is we cannot verify as of now, because we have still the first families are moving to these developments that were launched in July. So nearly half of the building is still empty. But what will govern there is the rental law. So families might lose their house if they go default. And the guarantees for the investors is the building itself, it's the real estate. So if there's anyone who doesn't pay the rent, if they then the real estate is received by the investors as a guarantee or default. Marcela, please. About the social incentivized debentures and the PPPs, the debentures is a tool with a tax exemption that exists for a long time now. And this decree has been last year, this decree came within a set of credit, in a credit package and several measures in order to incentivize investment. And that came as part of these new eligible projects for social rent and social housing. And this year we have this decree that limits the social housing specifically for PPP projects. And that means that from now on, this is a possibility, but those projects that are part of these projects are not social incentivized debentures because this tool did not exist at the time. So they are tools that pay all taxes and the traditional financing. They do not have any incentive tax measures because of their social impact or ESG. And these players are able to include the social housing in this tax incentive package. How did they do this? That's a good question. I don't know what was how this happened, because this was not the only benefit. It's the niche of this question of not only this new tool, but of the flexibilization of credit guarantees. So the fiduciary alienation became more accessible, and other credit lines benefited this kind of market. And that's for the future, looking towards the future and not the past, because in the future, and this incentivized debenture, you need a specific norm that allows for this emission. And that is why we still do not have anything designed or written about this PPP and incentivized debentures in Recife. We have this state incentivized, which is a PPP that will still be implemented and is under study. And the issue of the debenture is that for the company that is contemplated with the public service concession can become eligible within time under this regulatory framework for social housing, but it's still a hypothesis. That may happen, but it's not a reality right now. And about the weakening and who is this public target public and the scenario, I agree that in this model of social housing without the state in the market capital brings several social risks. In the example for who can access those developments, women, vulnerable communities, there are no government criteria. It's the companies that will design that. I remember that there was an algorithm that was written with these criteria, but it's something that's still under debate, but it's not intermediated by the state. And there's no, they also don't have the same guarantees of a purchase of a housing unit. And when you are in this context of rent and not acquisition, you have less legal guarantees and less protection, and how this would be done. And so it's more risky in this scenario.
Ótimo, obrigado, Marcela.
Thank you,
Natália e
Marcela.
Carolina.
Natalia and Carolina, please.
Bueno, creo que no había ninguna pregunta.
I don't think there was, we didn't have any specific question for us. So once again, I would like to thank everyone for our participation. I want to say that we have other works that you can consult that we published, especially on Argentina and the financialization issue. We also want to talk that Ivana Sokolok has some very interesting works on that, and you can deepen your knowledge on it. And I think that's it, and we don't have anything further. Thank you very much.
Carolina, quer fazer alguma colocação?
Carolina, do you want to say anything? Have any comments?
Hablo por las dos, Natalia. No, simplemente
No.
una cosa que también estamos pensando
Just
con
one
Natalia
thing
era
that we are
como,
thinking with, that I was thinking with
del
Natalia
desfase
is that
de lo que nosotros
that
reconocemos acá del
that
proceso,
we
¿no? De los actores
recognize the interest, how interesting this process is, and the players that operate in this rental market. In Buenos Aires, we invites us to think how to think these markets, how to regulate them, and within their particularities. Because when we see the other case, and we have these limits imposed by financialization, what we have are other issues here, like which require another kind of approach regarding public policies and also the concepts and how to conceptualize and capitalize these processes. That's all I wanted to say. Yes, just one question that I want to put here is that we think that is interesting is how much of these local dynamics, smaller dynamics in other cases of short-term rentals in other cities, because we identified, as we said, this polarization between small owners that manage their own unit and the large owners that they are not many in number, but they have many units in the city. And then within this diversity, what we found in the literature is that most work focus on this last group, like classifying the financialization in these concentrated markets or groups. And we have the idea that in Latin America, it is possible that this the smaller scale is also talking about processes that are important in our territories. And the question that we would like to learn about is that if we can find works that have this view in our particularities in Latin America. Maybe the Argentinian case is different, but in the small scale owners, and also how the platforms are impacting that. And we'd like to know how they are about the smaller processes and the smaller players that are engaged, that it should be interesting to look closer, and not because we look that when we look at these global trends, that maybe we do not miss what is happening in these smaller scale projects, because they are very important for us in relation to the amount and the offer and how it impacts the daily life of those players. And so when we talk about the heterogeneity, I think that these questions are the ones we are making ourselves, and I would like to also learn about what you are seeing on this and exchange information on this, please. Yes, because in regards to these smaller players, when we saw this polarization, maybe they do have an important role when we about on the offer and provision, and we're talking about housing. I mean, if a house owner puts decides to rent in a short-term rental model their unit, and they formed an important group. So they are also operating and molding and changing the possibility to access the conventional rental market. And we have a big housing market in Buenos Aires. And in the other seminar that we participated in Paulo in Chile, we've seen cases in Italy, for example. So it's not a phenomenon that is exclusive to our cities.
Legal. Eu aproveito já e
Yes.
convido vocês e a
I would
todos,
like
mas
to
vocês
invite you
duas
and
especificamente para ficarem para a
both of you
tarde, que vai ter
specifically, to
apresentações
stay
e
here with us
trabalhos
in the
sobre
afternoon, because we'll have a
Airbnb em São
presentation
Paulo
about
e
the
no Rio de Janeiro,
Airbnb
sobre aqui
in
do
São
pessoal
Paulo and
do
in Rio
LabCidade
de
que apoia
Janeiro
na mesa de
from
pauta.
our team and
Santiago,
from
suas considerações finais.
LabCidades. Santiago, your final remarks, please. Thank you. Well, just a final comment that I think that it's interesting, and I've seen this commonly in all our presentations, that there is an attempt to try to see what is public and what is private, because these are the two players that are also operating in these housing issues. And I think it is interesting to bring to the table that I believe it's an error to observe these two players, public and private, as completely different entities, because it's the public is the one who establishes the rules and establishes the norms with which the private will operate under in the city. Like Natalia said about the liberalization of the norms and the legislation, well, this liberalization is not an absence of the state, but it's a position that the state takes. It's a stand it takes in view of this issue. In the specific case of fibras in Mexico, and I think it's interesting to signal, is that it's the state that establishes the rules on how the fibras may operate. It's the player that regularizes them and has a regulatory framework under which it has to operate. But specifically about the fibras, their interface with the public agents is very specific. For example, the president of Spain, Aznar, is part of the joint commission in the government of a very important fibras in Mexico City. So there's this interaction between both poles that is very direct, and several other important players in fibras in Mexico belong to the municipality of Mexico City. So this interchange between the public and the private players is very direct, because the one participates and in the realm of the other. So this is an overview that we must think about what the participation of the state, or what the state's role should be within these new financial modalities that have a global reach, and the ability to gather capital in a very great manner, so that in addition to gains and financial gains, we can have positive or less harming impact on this. And once again, I'd like to thank you all for inviting me to participate.
No Brasil, a gente tem uma expressão
Here in Brazil,
giratória.
we have a discussion that is
Não sei se em
rolling
vocês também
doors.
algo
I'm not sure if
parecido.
in Spanish you have something
Lúcia, quer
similar
fazer
to
rapidinho
define these
suas
players.
considerações finais? E aí eu
Lucia, would you like to make your final
Felipe.
comments
Não, eu só
before
queria
closing?
o último
Yes, Felipe, thank you very much. Just a last
nessa
remark
fala do Santiago.
about what
Quando
Santiago
ele
just
se
said.
referia a essa nossa
When I
ampliada
refer to this
regulação, é justamente
expansion on
para
regulation,
escapar dessa
is
polarização
to
entre Estado e
leave
mercado,
this
e a gente
polarization
pensar
between
justamente
state
essa
and
imigração.
market, and
Eu
to
concordo
think about
plenamente
this
com você.
engagement.
E depois,
So I
a
agree with
última
you.
fala da Natália,
And
me
Natalia's
fez
last
pensar um pouco,
remark
porque
made me
pensar
think on the
no caso de
importance
vocês, né, nos pequenos
of
rentistas, né, que vão
thinking
ocupar aí
about those
terço, né, como
smaller
proprietários
rentists
da alocação
and the small owners in the short-term rental market, because one third of small investors also invest in fibras, who are also individuals, and we see the same thing here in Brazil. So we must look at this, the dissemination of access to the capital markets and these other modes that are made available by the digital platforms for families of, in general, medium and higher income that are able to invest in these other circuits. So I think this is a research agenda that is being open and is very interesting. I would like to thank organizers and all for inviting me to participate. I would also like to thank Felipe and our team and our presenters, because we had a very high-level debate, and I'm very happy to be part of this, and I'm taking with me several of your considerations and remarks for future reflections. Thank you very much. Well, so I'm going to conclude our panel. I'd like to thank Marcela, Mariana, Carolina, Natalia, Santiago, and Lucia Shimbo. Thank you very much to all of you, and also would like to invite everyone for our 2:30 p.m. panel, in which we will talk about the regulation of the center. And at 5 we'll have Miguel Robles Duran lecture about access to housing. And tomorrow we'll be back here as well. You can see the program on our website. And I would also like to thank our supporters, FAPESP, the Rosa Luxemburgo Foundation, and the Global Observatory on Short-Term Rentals, which was launched yesterday. And those who want to watch the previous presentations, they are available on our website. So that's it. Thank you very much.